everyone, and welcome to Quilt Stories. I'm Lisa Walton, and today I'm talking to Wen Redmond, who normally lives in New Hampshire, where it's really, really cold, but she's staying with her daughter at the moment, which is really nice to get to know her grandson a bit better. And also, I believe that you are tutoring him at the moment because of no schools, which must be an adventure. So welcome, Ren.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
It should be fun. I'm really interested in learning the technique. I know I'm not going to learn it all on one little video, but I'm fascinated by your end results. But the way you get there is really interesting to me, but I haven't quite worked out how to do it. So I'm hoping that I'm going to learn a little bit today. So I'll just go to the screen.
Oh boy. Well, I want to tell you, this is such an adventure. This whole thing has been an adventure. And when you say, how did you get to here? It basically, back in the early 2000s, I was able to join my photography. I love photography with my fiber work in a unique way because the computer and the printers were able to communicate, and I was able to print on cloth that was actually pre-prepared. It's a cloth made by inkjetfabrics.com, which I'm sure you can Google and get some. And they have all kinds of fabrics. And that's how I started my work. But I soon became somewhat bored with just white fabric. So I wanted to explore what I could print on. How could I extend, how could I make it my own and claim this instead of just a photograph on white cloth? I wanted it to be a photograph that I changed and then printed on a substrate or a surface that I made. So it would become even more personal. And that's why one of the reasons I called this piece Continuing the Conversation, because I'm always exploring new ways to do that.
It's a beautiful piece, and I'm fascinated by the fact that it's all cut up and stitched together, but we'll get to that fairly soon. So your starting point here was a photograph.
Yes, this is Bow Lake in New Hampshire, right near where I live, and I go out on my kayak. And this is actually a photograph that the color's been removed from. And I often will take a photograph, take the color out, so it's just these gray tones, because then when I use another photograph to influence it, it's almost like creating a collage, only you're working digitally. And I know what I know on Photoshop, but there's many apps and such that you can play with to do this sort of thing. It's called layering. And so I take this photograph and I layer it with the next photograph. Will show you how I keep going. So this particular photograph, I've already layered it with two other photographs. So you can keep adding layers, just like you can keep adding layers physically in a collage. So you can kind of see around the center focal point of color, there's tree imagery. And then the color, because I started with basically a black and white photograph, the color comes from either another photograph of a scene, or I paint my fabric and I'll take photographs of my fabric and then I'll layer that photograph. So that color then becomes influenced by the color that I've just put it on. It's sort of like mixing yellow and red to get an orange. So the photographs interact with each other.
So my Photoshop skills are really pathetic, and I can basically do about two things. But are your layered images, they're slightly transparent?
Right. So I know what I know on Photoshop. Believe me, there's so many things you can do with Photoshop. And I'm just scratching the surface. And what I do know leads me to manipulate photographs this way. So when I layer another photograph on top of another photograph and I put them together, they interact. So yes, they are somewhat transparent.
It makes a really interesting, complex image. It's lovely.
Well, that's what I like about it, because not only am I taking the photograph, I'm taking multiple photographs to equal a photograph. And then in this slide, what I do before I print on anything is I'll intensify generally the saturation of the color. And that's because, well, especially when I just print on fabric, fabric's absorbent by nature. So it'll suck in that inkjet ink and become somewhat duller than your
Okay.
photograph, you see. This particular piece was destined for a substrate made of molding paste, but I still like to up the saturation a little bit. Sometimes I play with the contrast just so that it's a little bit more intense, because when it's printed, it does become a little less so. And I've also sized the photograph here because I made this for an exhibit which had a size requirement of 30 by 50. So I had to figure out a size that would be easily divided, because I can't print 30 by 50 in my printer. My printer's 13 inches wide. So I have to figure out a way, or actually the photograph, this particular piece was printed on a 17-inch wide printer. So you can get printers that print different widths.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I think this one was divided into 4 sections. I think and so each section is 15 by 25 in order to make 30 by 50. So I divide this photograph into 4 sections in order to print it.
I'm just going to remind everybody that all the products that Wen is going to talk about to create her substrates and all the links to all her information are down below in the description box. So there's no need to madly write things down while you're watching. Just concentrate, because it's really so clever.
Thank you.
Starting point.
Okay, so my most favorite substrate or surface that I use to create collage or to add mediums to, even to print on, is the HTC Cutaway Stabilizer that you see. So it's basically interfacing. It's used to stabilize for people who do machine embroidery. You might know what I'm talking about. But anyway, so the stabilizer is it's in between heavy and medium. When you hold it up, it's almost like watercolor paper. There's not much draping. It's quite stiff, but it's not thick like stuff you make hats out of.
So this stabilizer is fairly easy to find, or have something similar?
Yes, you can find things similar. And I have my blog down at the very bottom of this slide, fiberartgoddess.blogspot.com. I didn't name that. I have to make a disclaimer. When my son was helping me set up my blog way back when, he said, "Oh, let's just use fiberartgoddess.com." And I'm like, okay. And I know it was going to be permanent forever and ever. All of the products are on my favorite products tab also on my blog. Do you see the antique iron in the corner? And I put those on the ruler, and then I take my slice with the rotary cutter.
Yes, we all have antique irons at home. Yes, they're beautiful though, aren't they? They're just a nice thing to have.
Yeah, I like them. So this photograph, this slide, I often will paint my interfacing. And it's a lovely surface because when I use it for any project, I often paint it. This is obviously for continuing the conversation, but I'm leaving the center white. I'm not painting the center. And when I paint the interfacing, I spray it down with water, and then I paint the edges. And I usually use up my extra paint container that it comes in and give it a good shake, and it's quite diluted. And then I just kind of put it on and I mush around the colors with my brush and allow what I call free mixing. I don't worry too much about the color other than I'm going for a color palette. So it mixes on its own. And very often, I always do this, by the way, on plastic, because nothing sticks to plastic. You want to put it on a plastic surface and then paint it, because the paint, if you put it on paper, it's just going to adhere, because paint can be somewhat binding that way. And then you can lift it off. And sometimes, because it's quite porous when it's wet, somewhat like a mini thin sponge, the paint sinks down through the interfacing and makes these incredible patterns underneath where it's touching the plastic. So that's my first step in this particular work as well. I decided to paint the interfacing because that's what I'm going to use as my substrate to print with.
As it's an acrylic paint, does that also make your interfacing stiffer?
Actually, because I've diluted it so much, it doesn't really affect the hand. Even I do this with fabrics as well. It doesn't really, I'd rather use water than the GAC 900 or whatever it is by Golden, because I feel that that makes it tackier and stickier. And I don't like the hand of the medium. I'd rather just add water to the acrylic paints. And I mix all of the acrylic paints. I mix my silk paints with my cheapy acrylic paints with the fancy Golden, you know, all of it can be mixed together if it's water-based.
Okay,
Yeah.
you're not a paint snob.
No, not at all. It's all ready for me to use. So at the bottom of this slide, you can see some sort of gold shininess. That's one of those kind of textural puddles that happens when you paint the interfacing. So I have flipped this over. The interfacing, by the way, was cut to 15 by 25 because that's going to be my printing surface. Also on this slide, you're going to see the lightweight molding paste. And there's a spread of it. I'm starting to spread it on the substrate of interfacing. So I'm going to spread this molding paste very thinly. You don't need much at all. It has the texture of creamy icing or toothpaste. And what it is lightweight molding paste is made from marble dust and polymer. Yeah. So you always want to be sure to get the lightweight molding paste because there is a regular molding paste, which is somewhat heavy. But if you spread the lightweight molding paste fairly thinly for two reasons, one, you want it to go through your printer, and two, it's sewable later after it's dried, of course. So I'm going to spread this on my substrate, my painted interfacing substrate really thinly. And then at that point, you can choose whether or not you want to add texture. Now, the thing with texturing is I generally just like the strokes of paintbrush or palette knife, just those very painterly textural gestures left on the molding paste. But you can stamp into it. You can make any kind of mark making you want, but being careful because if you make a mark on it, like when you're pressing into it, it kind of makes a ridge, and those ridges have to be pressed down. So oftentimes before I ever print it, I'll look at the molding paste after it's dried. I always let it dry overnight at least. And sometimes it's just a little too bumpy and you can kind of pick some of those off. But if that doesn't work, my next solution is I take it to my mixed media iron, put a piece of parchment paper on top, and yes, I iron it. And oftentimes ironing any really high ridges will help flatten those out. So it's not too thick to go through your printer. This is going to be my printing surface. Yeah,
Okay.
so that's how that's done. Yeah. Tell me how did I find this? I don't even remember how I found this product. Inkjet, and there's the website's down at the bottom. Inkjet is a product that you paint onto your surface that you're going to print on. And what this does is it enables your final print to be more clear, more colorful, and more long lasting than if you just put your substrate through the printer without it. In other words, it acts sort of like a glue for the inkjet ink to be able to stick to your surface. And this is especially important if you're making your substrate out of something like molding paste. Molding paste is somewhat absorbent, but it's also quite slick at the same time. So I always put Inkjet on any kind of slick surface, painted surfaces, molding paste, synthetic fabrics, and so on. And so So anyway, it comes in all these different colors. You can see that silver and pearl here, which is what I probably used in this piece, continuing the conversation. But they have clear, they have iridescent red, green, blue, lilac. They've got golden colors, but pearl is my favorite. It gives it a luster after you've printed on it. It's really a great product.
I think I've checked out the website. I think they might even have a sample pack of different
Oh,
ones.
yes, I'm so glad you mentioned that. They do have a
Mm.
sample pack. I think there's two different kinds, two different sample packs. And they come in these small little bottles, and they're great for trying out, because then you can not only experiment with it in a more, so you're not spending a lot of money, but also you can see which ones you like the best. And then you can
Yeah.
buy more of those. And you do need to stir them before you use them to mix, because they do settle. So here's my trusty Epson, which I've recently sold because last year I decided I was going to take a step back and see where I wanted to go next. But I kind of miss the printer now that I've sold it, but that's the way it is. Anyway, what it is an Epson 3880, and it prints 17 inches wide. My substrate there is 15 inches wide. And you can see the slight molding paste just in the center. So I've got the painted edges with the molding paste kind of just in the center of the substrates. And I'm printing that in the photograph that you saw before in 4 different sections. So that's coming out, and that's a section of the photograph that I composed using my Photoshop app. Each section in turn gets printed, and then I pin it up on my design wall, and I let them dry overnight. So when your print comes out, the Inkjet ink will still be a little damp, and you want to try and handle it on the sides rather than just grabbing it, especially when you have slicker surfaces as well. And I like to let that ink dry at least one night before I start messing around with it to do other processes.
It's quite a
So,
slow process in terms of steps and then letting things dry, isn't it?
yes, it is. But then you consider any particular, like if you're piecing triangles together and such, that takes time as well. For
So it would
me,
take patience. That's nice. Sort of,
yes,
it's
it
not
does.
something
And
that
it's
you can.
so very exciting to see it come out, you know. It's just
Yeah.
like, I do have to say one other thing really quickly. I always test. I usually always make a small 4x6 sample of my substrate with the molding paste, in this case, material on it, to test the color before I print my large sections. And that's to make sure I don't need to add different things to the photograph itself. And then the next step after that is I take it up to my attic, where I am right now in this slide, and I spray it very lightly and very quickly with a Krylon material. And Krylon has a number of different preservatives, is essentially what it is. And I prefer the UV resist clear in the upper left. And what I'm doing there is I'm spraying small postcard pieces to test the way it's going to adhere. So I'm up in the attic, I'm spraying up in the attic because it really stinks. It's not a very pleasant smell. I have tried doing it outside, but you don't want to do it outside in full sun, because I discovered that this particular product will become opaque if you're doing it in hot sun. So then you need to do it in the shade. So I just run up to the attic, I put a mask on, I take a deep breath, and I spray it onto the printed pieces. So that's the
Okay.
first step. I actually do 2 steps in preservation because I want to make sure that photograph's not going anywhere. The next step after that, I do sometimes, well, there's 2 ways, there's always more ways to do one thing. Here, I'm using acrylic felt as my quote unquote batting. It also serves as the backing. I only do 2 layers. And I think what I've done here, because I do different processes depending on what I think would be best, is I used a spray adhesive So I've sprayed the back of each section, and then I've laid them down on the felt and make sure they're very flat, they're touching in all the sections. The other way I do this is I use a paper-backed fusible, and I'll iron the fusible on the backs, and then I iron it on the felt. But I think because I was using such a great amount of molding paste, I decided to use the spray adhesive. Again, it's a spray product, and I have a number of allergies, so I'm very conscious of small particles in the air. Even when I use hairspray or cleanser for my house, I tend to be very careful. I don't want to inhale that. After that all dries, I trim it off, and then I decide on what I'm going to do for a quilting pattern. And for this particular piece, I decided that I didn't want to highlight all of the different trees and branches and such. I thought that would look a little bit dated, a little too much. So I came up with a whole bunch of my favorite quotes, and I love quotes, I love poems, and I just free motion quilted the words on each section. The only difficulty came was when I did the top left, and it has to read from top left to top right. I put the two together to see where the word should continue, and going across, and then on the bottom and such. But I really like the way that looks, and it goes with the title of the work called Continuing the Conversation, because it's text. It's somewhat readable too, which is pretty good. And that's all free motion. I don't use canned embroidery letters or anything. So after all of my quilting is done, I take it back to my plastic covered table, and I add another layer of protection. In this case, I don't know if you can see it right there. It says glazing medium, but I
Yep.
also use diluted liquid medium. Both the glazing medium and the diluted liquid medium. I don't like the gloss because it's too shiny, and I think the matte's too flat. So I go for the satin liquid medium, which you can buy, but if you happen to want to try it and you don't have satin medium, you just mix it halfway with gloss and half with the matte medium. And then in addition, I use it about 1-to-1 with water. So I dilute it, because if you don't dilute it, the medium tends to be, in my opinion, a little sticky. It can be, if you put them together, like to ship them or roll them, it will be sticky. So that's why I dilute it. And then I simply paint the diluted medium on top of the surface and let that dry. And this also helps bring out the color. Have you ever found a beach rock, for instance, and you look at it and it's so gorgeous because it's wet, and you bring it home and it dries and it's like, oh, why do I like this rock? That's why, because so this is the same sort of thing. It makes it, it enhances the color. So I let that dry. I just put it on top and paint it on and let it dry. And it's really a great way to protect even my fabric pieces. I'll put this on. That's another reason I dilute it originally, was because I was putting it on my pieced fabric works, and I wanted to retain a little less stiffness for those.
Okay.
But I found I like it diluted best anyway. So that's what that is. And now for the next step. So one of the things that I didn't like when I first started printing my pieces was having these big clunky sections of printed work. The other reason I started making these in sections or cutting them up is what I'm doing here in this slide. I take the section and cut it into a design, what I call a segmented quilt presentation. And another good reason for doing this is if you have a smaller printer and you want to print it, maybe you can only print 12 by something or 11 by something, and then you can print all the different sections of your photograph and use this particular technique to put them back together. So what I've done is I've cut these up into sections that will then create an interior design. It's kind of a nod to patchwork in a way, because I'm making sections to put back together again. So this is on my design wall, and that's what I'm doing.
Ooh, what's this?
Aha. So because I have all of these sections, and when I first started doing this, I thought, gee, if I bind each little section, I'm going to have these big bindings, and that's going to look ungainly. And I thought, what can I do? What can I do? So then I came up with using paint along the edge of each section. So this is Jacquard's bronze fabric paint, but any thicker paint would work. For instance, the golden paints are very the acrylic flow paints are very liquidy, but you could mix those with gel medium. You want a little bit thicker paint, so I generally go for the cheaper paints because they have more binding in them. And I just hold up the section and I paint across the edge. And when I first started doing it, I was like, oh no, it's on the front. And I'm like, oh, what have I done? But then I realized I liked it. I love those undulating edges. And it's like a happy accident, it was just great. So I do all four edges and I let them dry. And that's how I get that. But the really long pieces, some of them I leave long. I leave those on the table and I just overhang section by section. So these are all painted now, and they're drying and they're waiting for the next step. And I just love that. And when it goes together, when you put the quilt back together again, you can see just this hint of bronze around the edges. And it's like a frame. I just think that it really works well. And it seals those edges. So here it is. Yes, it's pinned to the design wall. You can kind of see a yellow pin. One of the last things I do now to my work is I like to add highlights using additional mediums. And I call these specialty mediums. This particular medium is by Licktex, but all of the different paint companies and medium companies have their own brands and different kinds of specialty mediums. This particular medium is called black lava, but you can get mica, you can get golden flakes, you can get fiber paste, there's all kinds, and they're fun to, unfortunately, they don't have samples of these. It's fun to experiment with those. However, I have found I don't like to use them full strength out of the jar. So I often will scoop out a little bit of the specialty medium and put it on a palette. And my favorite palette are the recycled veggie trays from the grocery store. They come in, they're styrofoam here. And rather than toss them into the landfill, I use those for my palette. So I put a little of the black lava specialty medium on the palette, and then I add another dollop of gel medium being the stiffer, not pourable medium. And I mix them. And that way, the black lava is more dispersed. And then I apply it to the piece where I think that needs a little bit of bling. I really like the way that looks.
You really are the sort of the product queen, aren't you? Sort of layer upon layer.
I probably should write these companies and say, I'm promoting your stuff, and then maybe they'd give me a discount. You can see the paint really well there. And then this is the last step. So in this slide, I'm sewing these sections back together again. And I use, oh gosh, what's the name of the needle I use? It's long and thin, chenille, I think it is.
Yep, chenille needle.
Anyway, yeah, I think it is. I can't quite remember. You need a sturdy needle, but you don't want a thick needle to go through because it makes it very hard if you have a thick needle. And even in this case, it's sort of like, so the molding paste, when you're done, it has the feel and thickness of fine leather, So and like leather, once you put your needle through it, that needle hole will stay. So that's something to be aware of when you're quilting as well. So that is why I have a pair of pliers there, because I can get it through, but I can't necessarily pull the needle all the way out. So I often have to have those pliers there to grab the end of the needle and give it a good yank. I use pearl cotton very often to sew my pieces together, a little bit thicker bodied thread, number 5, I think it is. And I've recently discovered this variegated wool. It's a little thinner than the pearl cotton, but it seems to be quite strong. And so I just kind of do this running stitch. I make X's. I like them to be very irregular. Alternatively, I will just tie it. Instead of doing all that hand stitching, I come along every 4, 5, 6 inches and do go in and come back out and then just tie it in a granny knot. And I used to do that a lot with old quilts that I have. And it kind of comes out with lots of threads, and that's kind of fun too. And I use that as a textual thing. And I'm working on a piece now called The Sacred Gift, and I'm using a lot of that tying just for the loose threads. So
Are
that's
you
that.
going all the way through or just through a
Yeah.
top layer?
No, I'm going all the way through to the back. Now remember, it's just 2 layers, but it's a kind, so the edges, remember the molding paste was sort of in the center, but it also has quite a bit of medium on it from the liquid medium that I put on and the spray as well. And then of course you can see the paint, and that's a little hard to get through sometimes too. So I may vary my stitch length depending on where the paint lands. But I like the way it looks when it's done. Don't try it with metallic thread because that breaks all the time. So this is a detail, and I think you can see the stitching. And sometimes I'll use, like in the center where it's dark, I've used some darker threads, and then up toward the edges and out,
Yeah.
I'll use lighter threads to kind of match it. Sometimes I'll contrast it. That's another design element. So the paint adds a design element, the stitching adds another design element. And I think the text works really well on that. I think it would that looks better than it would if I had tried to accent all those branches and stuff. I don't think it needed it.
So
Yeah.
here is the finished piece, and it's really
And
beautiful. There's so much to look at. There's stitching, there's words, there's the beautiful photography and the overlay. And it's just a really fabulous combination of techniques, Wen.
thank you so much. I really, really love doing this. It's so exciting to get an idea in your head, and it's not physical, and you bring it out and you put it on a surface like this. And the molding paste, when you see it physically, you'll see the textural marks of the molding paste. So you see so much here, but then if you saw it in the eyeball to eyeball, as it were, and then you'd see the lava medium. And I love the way the stitching looks and the whole thing. It's really, I don't know, I like it.
Great. That was great because now I understand. I know
Yeah.
I have your book and I have read it, and it's really interesting, but to hear it from your own words, it's even better. So now I have the double whammy and I'm going to go and buy some of those products. I can see my bill at the art supply store really building.
Oh, it's dangerous.
I'm sure everyone's really enjoyed listening to this and seeing how you create your amazing masterpieces. And I'm hoping that people will like to subscribe. There's a button, should be in the middle of the screen coming up. And please subscribe and hit the like button to inspire me to make lots more videos. And as I said, Wen has a beautiful book, and I encourage you to check it out. There's a link below along with all her other links. And unfortunately, Wen is retired from teaching at the moment, but her work is still out there. And I know you actually supply to quite a few galleries as well, don't you?
I try and shows, exhibits, SAQA exhibits. It's out there as much as
Yep.
possible.
Wen is also a member of Studio Art Quilt Associates, which we're
Yep.
both proud members of. And I do encourage you to check out their website and have a look at some of the exhibitions. And Wen seems to be in quite a few of them, which is great. So I'd like to thank you so much for your time today and for sharing all those little hints and tricks. This is
Yeah.
really good. And I look forward to seeing what you come up with next in your semi-retirement.
Yes, we'll
So
have to see. Thank you
I
so
know we
much for
make
having me. This has been so much fun. Thank you.
it is fun. It is fun. And I tell you, the
Yes.
feedback that I get from people about how much they're enjoying these videos and learning more about people. And I think what happens is not only do you learn about the art, but you learn about the person and the thought processes. And so, yeah, I've learned a lot today just about giving it a try. And I wonder what will happen if I smear this on my fabric or print it out. So
Well, you never
it's
know.
great. You never know. So thanks for watching, everybody, and bye for now.